Welcome to Democracy Does, the Civic Power Playbook, a podcast that cuts through the noise to explain what's really happening in our democracy. Each episode breaks down key issues with insight from policy experts and change makers, giving you clear tips to take action. Whether you're fired up or feeling stuck, you're in the right place to get informed and get inspired, because democracy works best when we all participate. Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another edition of Democracy Does, the Civic Power Playbook. I am thrilled today to have our guest, Professor Shannon Lane, with us. She is the director of the Nancy A. Humphreys Institute for Political Social Work at the University of Connecticut. She is a trained social worker, but has used that lens to guide her work in local, state, and federal policy. And she has worked for the United States Senate, has authored several books, dozens of articles, and really helps us understand how policy impacts so many things that we do in our daily life. Thank you so much, Professor Lane, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to have you because a lot of times we have to explain there's a disconnect between how policy impacts the day to day. And one of your core focal points is how voting matters. Voting really does impact how we live day to day. So before I jump into the meat of my questions about the Voting Rights Act and all of that, can you just tell me how you came to this point in your career where this really is your focus, where policy and the day to day really meet?
Absolutely. I feel really lucky that my very first job, actually as an intern in college, I worked for Tom Daschle, who at the time was the Democratic leader of the United States Senate. And it was a pretty great first job. And working for Senator Daschle really helped me to see how important policy is in the day-to-day life of everyone. We worked on issues around people with disabilities. One of Senator Daschle's big focuses was healthcare. And so we really got to see that the decisions that were made were affecting people's daily lives. And so I went back to school and got my master's in social work and realized that there was an opportunity to take the values and skills that I had learned in my social work program and bring them back into the policy arena to try to influence change happening in a way that was congruent with the values of social work, that made people's lives better, and that helped to uplift the voices of people who sometimes just are not heard in the policy process. So I've been an academic for about 20 years now, but I have always stayed connected to my policy work. So I'm an advocate. I'm an elected member of my local board of education. And for the last year, I've been the director of the Humphreys Institute at the University of Connecticut. That's really the place that I get to help people bring social work and communities and policy all together.
That's terrific. Congratulations, first of all,
Thank you.
on that progression. So many questions I want to ask you because, first of all, I got to ask about the social work thing because I saw one of your lectures, and there are people who would say, "Well, you're a social worker; you shouldn't be political. So why are you muddying the waters, so to speak?"
There are a lot of people who think that. I think sometimes because they don't know the range of things that social workers do. But I think there's also this idea that being involved in political processes makes us less professional or makes us not objective. And the argument that I would make is that policy and politics affect everything that we do. So if I, as a social worker, choose to deliberately ignore the policy arena and the political arena, then I am missing out on chances to make life better for the clients and the communities that I work with. So I think it's very important that social workers in the typical social work settings are not actively encouraging their clients to vote for a specific candidate or a specific party. So when we engage in the social work arena, it's generally a nonpartisan work. But if I'm sitting with a client and they tell me a story and I know that we could make a change in the policy arena that would make their life better, I believe that it is part of my ethical obligation as a social worker to support them in sharing that story with a policymaker, or for me to share an anonymous version of their story with a policymaker, because the people who are making policy need to know how it's affecting people in real lives. And that's really, for us as social workers, we are often connectors between multiple systems and worlds. And this is a good example of that.
Let's talk about the importance of voting, for example. When you mentioned the importance of knowing how to inform political figures, the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, and it has been back in the public square now. For some of us who may not know, why do you even think that the Voting Rights Act was needed to begin with?
That is a great question. And an interesting one, because I do think that often we take the Voting Rights Act for granted, right?
Right.
I think the majority of people in the United States have always lived in a world where there was a Voting Rights Act. And I think perhaps communities of color have a more visceral memory of what the world
Yes.
was like before the Voting Rights Act. But fundamentally, the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965 to protect voters of color from racial discrimination. And it has really achieved that goal for much of the last 61 years. There are folks who call it the greatest achievement of the civil rights movement. I've also seen it called the crown jewel of the civil rights movement. And it really has met the goals that it set out to accomplish in many ways. We have really narrowed the gap between voter turnout for white Americans and non white voters. In particular, if you look at voting in the South, we have seen Black voters in the South now turn out at rates either equal to or surpassing white voters in the South, which, if you can imagine the Jim Crow world before the Voting Rights Act, is a pretty significant accomplishment of any piece of legislation.
And you talk about all of these great accomplishments that the Voting Rights Act was able to make inroads, I should say. And now we have seen it start to be stripped away, starting in 2013, when federal oversight in areas where people of color could vote, that was being removed. Um, Now it's been gutted even more. Can you talk about what has been stripped away and what the implications are of those changes now?
Yes, absolutely. So let's go back. 2013 is a great place to start. So 2013, the court case in 2013 was Shelby County v. Holder. And that court case gutted the pre-clearance requirement of the Voting Rights Act, which essentially was the part of the Voting Rights Act that said if you are an elections administrator in a state that has been known to discriminate, you need to check with the federal government, with the Department of Justice, before you make significant changes to your voting. So preclearance is this, wonky academic legal word for it, but essentially saying if you have a history of discrimination, we want to make sure you don't continue to discriminate. So we're going to
Correct.
check on you. So Shelby v. Holder got rid of that, which made it a lot harder for the Voting Rights Act to achieve its goals. Um, and then starting in 2021, we started to see some changes to Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is what's been happening lately. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act was the section that allowed the creation of what the law calls majority minority districts.
Mm.
And these are districts that are essentially drawn to make sure that people of color have access to power in their voting. And to give you a sense of how well this law worked to increase the number of folks of color who were elected to office. In 1983, so as this law was being enacted and legislated and moved through the process, there were 26 majority minority districts in the United States. Today, there's 140 House districts that are majority minority districts. And those are far and away the most likely places of people of color to be elected to the House of
Mm.
Representatives. So it's Section 2. And again, I know this is sort of wonky legal academic
No,
language,
but this is helpful.
but Section 2 really is about creating and allowing space for those districts to exist.
Now that means there's been some major gutting of the most recent case that happened, believe, based in Louisiana, where they are starting to chip away at that. They're starting to eradicate that, and they're creating it so that, for example, those districts that you're mentioning, there was only, I think 1 of 6 districts that were majority minority, and I think they're trying to even get rid of that.
There were
It
2 in
there were 2.
Louisiana that were 2 districts in Louisiana that had a majority of Black voters and were represented by Black, members of Congress, and it looks like both of those will disappear after the Supreme Court ruling.
What is it may sound like a simple question, but what does that mean? What is that really gonna look like when we talk about who is represented in power?
Yeah. So I think the most important thing, so this case, if people want to go look it up, it's Louisiana v. Calais, Callais. And I think it's important to remember that with the Shelby decision or with this decision, nobody's erasing the Voting Rights Act, but what they're doing is making it harder and harder to enforce it. And when we're not able to enforce a law, essentially it doesn't exist anymore, right? It doesn't matter if a law is on paper if we can't do anything to make sure that it continues to happen. Um, so I think when we look at the results of this particular Supreme Court ruling, we can look at specifically what the ruling says, and
Yeah.
then we can look at sort of the answer to your question of what it's going to mean for people who live outside of Louisiana. So this specific ruling said that these 2 districts in Louisiana were an unconstitutional gerrymander, and basically created a new test for drawing districts. Essentially, what is happening now is that if you are drawing a congressional district and you can argue that you drew it the way that you did because of people's party affiliation, because
Mhm.
they're Democrat or Republican, and not because of people's race, then you're allowed to continue. And so while that decision does not technically anywhere say you can't create a majority minority district, in effect, it makes those creating those districts technically unconstitutional.
Mhm.
And so it gets the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. What I think that's going to mean for the country, I think it's a little early to know for sure, but
Yes.
we are seeing states like Louisiana and Alabama race to redraw their districts in advance of this year's of the midterm elections here in 2026. Um, I think that we will see fewer candidates of color elected to the United States Congress. And I also think we've really been talking about Congress. I also think we're going to see some effects on state legislatures as well.
Mhm.
Because if we can't have majority minority districts for Congress, then likely states are going to assume that we can't have those at the state level anyway. And so whether or not you look at your own congressional district or your own state and you think this will affect your representation in Congress, you also might want to look at your state legislature because this might affect the way that districts are drawn in your state legislature as well.
Thank you for breaking that down in such clear, in clear language, because I don't think people really, a lot of times things get mired in technical jargon, and it's hard for people to even feel like this is going to impact them. So when we think about the policies that you talk about as a social worker, how is this? How does this play out in real time, in real fashion? Whether it be healthcare, whether it be any getting resources, if you're in an underserved community, how does this?
I think there are two important ways to look at this. Number
Yeah.
one is it's likely that this is going to change who is in Congress.
Yes.
And I think it remains to be seen whether that will also then affect who's in control of Congress, which then
Mhm.
has a much more significant effect. So I think all the policies that you talked about, I very much try not to assume that someone will support or oppose a specific policy because of their race or gender.
Yes.
But I think if we see 20 different members of Congress compared to what we would have had without this act, then we would expect to see a significant change in policy based on that. And certainly, as a social worker, my first concern is often what's going to happen to policies that affects the people who are the most vulnerable in our
Mhm.
society.
Yes.
As here in Connecticut and other places, we have looked at the effects of the last several years of legislation and tried to figure out how do we make sure that folks who are getting, you know, federal assistance now can access assistance within the state.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
think it's likely that if we see more changes to the federal legislature and more changes to policy as a result, we'll have to continue to do that.
Yes.
The other thing that I just want to add is I think this has a really significant impact on voting
Hmm.
because as people hear the news about this kind of law, this kind of decision that seems to really suggest that gerrymandering is fine and partisan gerrymandering is fine.
Yeah.
And people also have heard a lot on the news about things like the SAVE Act at the federal level, which did not pass. And I feel like I
Uh-huh.
have to say that every time I say the word
Please.
SAVE Act.
Thank
It
you.
it did not pass. And yet people have heard so much about it on the news that once you hear about these things enough, you naturally assume that they are now law. And so
Correct.
I do think people's inclination to vote or feeling like their vote makes a difference is really affected by everything that's happening right now. And that itself is going to have policy implications if we change who's actually showing up on election day.
I'm really glad you mentioned that. So, can you just emphasize that how it matters? Because I think there is this disconnect where people hear, as you mentioned, things about, the SAVE Act, which didn't, which was trying not to save people's right to vote, but was trying to destroy it. But can you emphasize that? Because I have a feeling when I talk to some people, there's this inertia, this attitude of inevitability that, oh, this is already going to happen. My voice doesn't matter. How do you combat that? What do you say about that?
Think, first of all, just to validate, that's a really natural inclination in
Yes,
today's time, right? We are inundated with news
correct.
about really terrible things happening everywhere in the world. We
Correct.
are often seeing things about like the SAVE Act that have a real potential to suppress the vote, and then we don't really see any follow up. So it's
Yes.
big news that the SAVE Act was introduced. It's not actually big news that it failed in the Senate.
Yeah.
And so I think it's totally understandable that people are discouraged. So my biggest message to people is that doing something is better than doing nothing. And
Mhm.
it is okay to say, I can't go and run for office tomorrow, right? I can't take over, my community and make it better tomorrow. But I can check my voter registration and make sure that I'm registered to vote and I know where to go. On our website, so I run the Voting as Social Work website, which is part of this national coalition of social workers. We have something called the Power of Three Pledge. And so we ask people to check their own voter registration and then go talk to three people about voting.
Mm,
And so I think that's really the first message I give people. It is a hard time to be active in politics. It's a hard time to be a human being in the world. But we can break fixing those hard things into
mm,
smaller acts. And as a social worker, something I learned the very first day of my program is that we can look at a system and say, this system is not working. And I think we can look at our system today and say, this is not a politically just system that we live in. As a social worker, I know that I have to do both things at once. I have to try to fix that system and I have to try to do whatever good I can inside that existing system.
yes.
Because
Yes.
if I do only one, I'm failing in my ethical obligations, right? If I'm only trying to change the system, but I'm ignoring day to day life under that system, then people's lives aren't better. And if I'm only helping people navigate the system, but I'm not making it better, then people's lives aren't better. We have to do both.
Excellent. That leads me to the top 3 tips then that you would recommend when people they do want to do something, but they feel overwhelmed. You touched on it briefly, but just expound on well, you do. Don't let me, you're the professor. You're the professor. You're the expert. But what are three top tips? You mentioned as one of them, but I think they're excellent and they're accessible. So yeah, please explain.
Well, first of all, you should know better than to ask a professor to say only three things about anything. So, absolutely, starting with making yourself vote ready is a great place to start, right? Are you registered to vote? Has your polling place moved? Has your elected official changed? Voting and Social Work has some great resources on that. Ballotpedia has some great resources on that. And I'm also going to plug Vote 411, which is the League of
Okay.
Women Voters nonpartisan website, which has some phenomenal resources about voting and helping you find information about accessing your right to vote. So I think that's the first thing. Start with yourself. This is another social work thing. We got to help ourselves. We got to put your own oxygen mask on before you put somebody else's mask on. So that's the first thing I recommend to people. The second thing that I recommend to people is to think about serving as an election official or an election protection worker. I have been working elections in my town for the last decade. And I will tell you honestly, I've learned more about elections from working at the polls than I did from any academic class that I took. Hopefully, none of my professors are listening to this to hear me say that. Um, so, working as a poll worker, we are desperate for poll workers in the United States. Our elections workforce is aging out. We need more now because a lot of states have early voting and multiple ways to
Yes.
vote. Um, it's a great way to get to know your community and really understand how elections work. And in almost every place in the country, it pays money.
Yes.
So you can get paid to work the polls on election day. And you can go to eac.gov, which is the Elections Administration Office, and they can navigate you to how to work the polls in your area. Or you can just put into a search engine your state and elections workers or poll workers, and that will help you find it. If you don't want to be a poll worker, some people, it's often like, it's early in the morning to late at night. It's a big time
Yes.
commitment. There's a
Yeah.
lot of reasons people might not want to do it. There is a great set of election protection volunteers, which a bunch of national organizations that came together. And so folks go to 866 Your Vote. You can find a way to be an election volunteer. And sometimes that just means standing outside the polling place with a t-shirt on that says, ask me a question. And
Huh.
that gives you the opportunity, if somebody's saying like, they're not letting me vote and I'm not sure what to do, you don't have to fix it for them, but you can connect them with lawyers who are elections experts back at like the headquarters, and those people can help them access their right to vote. So I would say that's my second thing is getting involved on
Yes.
election day. And then my third thing is we got to lean into community.
Mm,
It's really isolating sometimes to sort of we see the news, we maybe scroll through our social media feeds and we see all sorts of things happening. And I know it has social in the name, but connecting with people on social media is a great start. But I swear I am not a boomer, but I really want to encourage people to, my kids would say, touch grass and go out and engage with people in real life. Go to your school board meeting, your um, town council meeting, your city council meeting. Go talk to other people in your community, in your profession, in your organizations who have the same values as you and want to get involved.
mhm.
Um, if we feel like we have to change the world alone, we will feel discouraged
That's
because
right.
it's just not possible. If we feel like there are other folks around us who have the same goals as us and have our backs and we're in this together, you are much more likely to make change happen. And you're much more likely to feel good about continuing to make that change happen.
Mhm. Thank you. That is excellent advice, and it's doable. It's
Mhm.
accessible. It's within what people can do for themselves. If you're overwhelmed with this, there's a way to do it here, which I love. So, Professor Lane, where can people learn more about you, your work, or other resources that you would like to direct people to?
I always have more resources to direct people to, but so you can go to politicalinstitute.uconn.edu. That's the website of the UConn Political Institute. As I said, we run the Voting and Social Work website. We also run an annual campaign school for social workers, but it's really open to anybody who wants to come hang out with a bunch of social workers for a weekend and learn about running for office, working on campaigns, having a leadership role in politics. The next campaign school will be March of next year in Hartford, Connecticut, and we would love to have more folks come and join us. So you can find more information about that there. I also, as I said, I think, the League of Women Voters is a phenomenal resource. Another of my favorite resources is an organization called Vote ER,
Mhm.
VOT-ER.org. It was created by an emergency room physician who actually was just selected to a public health commission in Mayor Mamdani's cabinet in New York City. And the
Nice.
idea is that doctors and nurses and public health folks run into lots and lots of people who are probably not registered to vote. And so you can go to their website and you can get a free badge, and that badge has a QR code. And I just wear it all the time like a big nerd.
Uh-huh.
And then if people have questions about voting, they can scan that QR code and check to see if they're registered to vote. It's an amazing, wonderful resource for people.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for providing those resources and for breaking this down for people to understand so that it is accessible. This was terrific.
Can I
Yes.
offer one more thing? So
Please
I am
do.
very terrible at promoting it, but I actually have written 2 books.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Where can people find your books?
And my publishers are probably just so tired of me forgetting about it. But if you go to my website, which is Dr. Shannon Lane,
Huh?
drshannonlane.com, I have links on the main page. I wrote a book called Political Social Work Using Power to Create Social Change.
Okay.
And then I also wrote a book called Social Welfare Policy in a Changing World, which is more of like a textbook, but
Yeah.
it's sort of goes over all of the main areas of social policy in the United States and what's the history and what was happening with it in November of 2024 when we published the book. So some things have changed since then.
Yes. Yeah, but well, we would love to learn more about the work that you do, and the work you're doing is so important and real. I mean, it's tangible, it's practical, it's what's happening in real time. So, thank you so much, Professor Shannon Lane. I so appreciate you being here with us today.
Thank you. And thank you for everything you're doing to make sure that people are learning and talking and thinking about democracy. We need all of that and more right now.
It's absolutely my pleasure. And now it's time to recap Professor Lane's top 3 tips. First, she says, make yourself voter ready. Also, she says, think about serving as an election protection worker or getting involved in some way. And finally, she says, lean into community, engage with others. You don't have to do it alone. And to learn more about Dr. Shannon Lane, to check out her books, her articles, and hear some of her lectures, you can go to Dr. Shannon Lane, DrShannonLane.com. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope you're feeling a little more hopeful, a little less stuck, and maybe even inspired to take action, because democracy does work when we all participate. Let's get in the game together. Until next time, I'm your host, Robin Hamilton.